Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airthings Masters. We are in the semifinals in a match between Daniil, Dubov and Teymur Rajabov, and the two of their first games ended in a draw. Then Teymur won game 3 and this is now game 4. Dubov needs a win here so he can draw the first match and then go into match 2 looking for a win, or if he draws the game or loses, then Rajabov wins the match. So without further ado, let's check it out. And before we check out the game, I would just like to mention I do have some very nice merchandise for you. I haven't updated my merch shop for like 2 years, but I haven't had any designs. So here is a very nice design by Adam Genesis. It's Paul Morphy rocking the Captress Power Glove. So if you guys are interested in this, you can check it out. I will put a link in the description below. Also some nice mugs and some ornaments are featured there if you guys are interested in that. So that being said, let's check out the game. Dubov with the white pieces opens with e4. We have c5 by Rajabov, knight to f3, knight to c6, and d4 now. So striking in the center, just a normal open Sicilian. C captures on d4, knight captures, and now e5, kicking this knight away. And you don't really gain anything by capturing, you will simply improve black's position in the center. So knight to b5, now with ideas of maybe knight to d6 check, and black defense, knight to d6, and now knight to c3. And now, if you're not ready and this knight comes to d5, then you might have problems, as both of the knights will be attacking that c7 square. So here, a6 kicking the knight back to a3, and now b5. Interestingly, Rajabov already had this position in the previous month in the Sicilian Open against Wesley So, where bishop to e6 was played and their game ended in a draw. So of course Dubov is familiar with this, and he probably prepared something very nice for Rajabov. So b5, we have knight to d5, and now comes knight to f6, attacking the knight here, and Dubov just pins it, bishop to g5. Sometimes when I have this position, for example, if I'm playing bullet or something, I will go bishop to e3. It's a very sneaky move. It's not a good move, but unless your opponent knows the absolute best, rook to b8, you will have a very nice game. And sometimes your opponent will just play something weird like bishop to e7, and then you win the game with just bishop to b6. So I've done it plenty of times, so you can try it, knight to c7 check, and that's it. A bit of a cheapo, but you know, if it works. So bishop to g5, of course, Dubov doesn't try something like that against Rajabov, and bishop to e7 now. And here just bishop captures on f6, and now this knight on d5 reigns supreme. So bishop captures on f6, and now c3. c4 is also possible. Dubov prefers c3, and now bishop back to g5, not allowing this knight to have this constant pressure on the bishop. Interestingly, Wesley So had this exact position against Rajabov also in the Sicilian Open. They played 2 games in this line. Their rook to b8 was played by Rajabov, but here we have bishop to g5. So Rajabov deviates from the game he played against Wesley So, and now knight to c2. Dubov prepares to bring the other knight back into the game. We have rook to b8 now, and only now h4. In this position, the absolute top move that's always played is a4, but Dubov switches it up and goes for h4 instead. It's not a new move, it has been played before. Bishop back to h6 by Rajabov, not interested in picking up the pawn. You can capture the pawn, but if you don't know why you're capturing the pawn, and this is all well within Dubov's preparation, you don't capture the pawn. So bishop back to h6, and now again, there are some games where a4 was played, where g3 was played, where g4 was played, but we have bishop to e2 by Dubov, and it is only as of move 14 that we have a completely new game. So let's see what happens here. Castles by Rajabov, and now bishop to g4 by Dubov, placing this bishop on this long diagonal and preparing some very nice trick. g4 is also looking very scary. If g5 comes, black could be in trouble, but if g4, bishop to f4, and then who can tell what's really happening here. So instead, bishop to g4 by Dubov, and bishop to e6 now by Rajabov, making room for the queen so he can get a double attack on the bishop. And here again, king to f1. Like we said in the previous video, king f1 is the new castles. Now players just want to play king f1 and bring the rook into the game to attack the opponent's king. So here, queen to d7 with a double attack on the bishop here. And now you could try a lot of ideas here, but Dubov finds the most interesting one, bishop to f5. And now what's the plan with bishop to f5? It seems like you're giving up a pawn, but not really, because if bishop captures here, e captures and queen captures. Do you see how white wins here? It's a very interesting line, so even feel free to pause the video and win this game for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on winning the queen, or rather the knight. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's knight c to b4. And now the knight is lost. The knight is lost because whatever you do, if the knight captures, just knight e7 check, picks up the queen. If you defend the knight, it's all the same, doesn't really matter. You could even try and defend it with the queen, but it still doesn't matter. You still just pick up the knight. It's a free knight. If queen captures, then this picks up the queen. So in no way can you defend defend this knight. So a very tricky idea by Dubov, but Rajabov of course figures it out. He plays king to h8. Now the king is well beyond the reach of this knight. And now queen to h5. Dubov's pieces are coming closer and closer to Rajabov's king, and only now bishop captures on f5. And here e captures on f5 by Dubov, saying that this will be an extremely strong pawn. Maybe g4, g5 in the future will be possible. Queen captures on f5 was also an option. For example, queen captures, and now if black goes in for the trade, now you play e captures with the threat of f6. And if black pushes f6, then you go g4, and it could be a very, very tricky line. Rook g1, maybe you're threatening g5, but again, it's hard to say what's happening here. And also, Dubov is already down in the match by a point, so he really needs a win. He can't drag it out to some sort of a draw. So e captures on f5 instead, keeping the tension. And now, of course, you do not want to allow white to push f6, so black pushes f6. And now rook to d1 by Dubov, bringing that rook into the game. And Rajabov goes a5. He just continues advancing his pawn on the queen side. He says, I'm very safe here on the king side. And Dubov again, rook to h3, going for that attack, similar to what we've seen in the game Levon Aronian played against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, bringing that rook into the game, or rather, no, not Maxime, who was it against? Levon played it against someone. Can't remember. I'm gonna blame it on the anesthesia. So rook to h3, and now rook b to e8. Here you're basically deciding between rook b to e8 followed by e4, or maybe trying to get this knight away from d5 with something like knight to e7. And now, for example, captures, and rook h to d3, going after this pawn, which is of course playable. But Rajabov doesn't like that, so he instead goes rook to e8. We have rook h to d3 now, again with two rooks on the d file. Now after the knight moves, this pawn will be under attack. And here we have a very interesting e4 move. And now Dubov needs to decide what to do here. Does he move the rook, or does he play something else? More often than not, Dubov will play something else. So here, knight captures on f6. And what do you play here? The queen and rook are under attack. If you capture with the pawn, then the bishop will be hanging. Also, the rook can capture on d6. So capturing with the pawn really makes no sense. So here, rook captures on f6, and now the d6 pawn is defended twice. So what was Dubov's idea here? Well, Dubov's idea was rook captures on d6. And now again, we have this crazy position where yes, the d6 square was guarded twice, but there's also the problem of the rook being on e8. So Rajabov has to be very careful here. So you either capture the rook on d6 with rook captures on d6, rook captures on d6, and now bring the queen to c8, keeping an eye on both of these pieces, which seems to be quite passive for black. So instead, Rajabov goes for rook captures on f5. He wants to trade queens here. And now the thing is, Dubov has 6 minutes on the clock, whereas Rajabov has only 3 minutes on the clock. And here, rook captures on c6 by Dubov. So again, if queen captures, then the queen no longer guards the rook. You pick up the rook. So here, Rajabov plays the absolute best. Rook captures on f2 with check. He has to give up this rook, so he best grabs some material while he's at it. King captures, and only now queen captures on c6. And we get this crazy position where the material is completely equal, and who knows what's happening. Rajabov's king is much safer. Rajabov has a very strong passed pawn here, but again, his pieces are also somewhat tied down to the defense of each other. So here, you don't want to allow rook to f8 to come with check. First, Dubov brings the king to safety, king to g1, and here Rajabov goes for b4. And again, interestingly, it's 4 minutes for Dubov and only 50 seconds for Rajabov, but he does get a 10 seconds increment per move, so it's not all that terrible. And here, you decide between queen captures on a5 or just c captures on b4. Dubov decided for c captures on b4, both are fine. And now comes a captures on b4. Of course, you don't capture the knight because queen captures on e8 will be checkmate. So we have a captures on b4, and now again knight captures on b4. And now Dubov grabbed the pawn, and he has two connected passed pawns on the queen side. If he can get them rolling up the board, will be very good for him. But of course, Rajabov will try everything that it doesn't happen. Queen to b6 with check, connecting with the knight, but again, you will not be able to capture the knight because Rajabov's rook is still hanging here. So king to h1, of course you cannot go to f1 because of rook f8 check, and only now rook to f8. This, like we already mentioned, loses the queen captures. So rook to f8, now this threat is finally a reality, and now Dubov just plays a3. There's no plan to it. He didn't want to move the knight anywhere all that quickly. Maybe you could have done knight to d5, sacrifice the b2 pawn, but Rajabov is extremely low on time, and Dubov is trying to make use of that. And here e3. Here Rajabov just starts pushing his passed pawn with queen to e5 by Dubov. Now with some very sneaky ideas of, let's say, rook to d6 attacks the queen, and then rook captures bishop because the pawn cannot capture, it's pinned. And here Rajabov almost lost on time. With 1 second on the clock, Rajabov played queen to g6. Now the queen is very safe here. And Dubov continued now with knight to d5. He starts bringing his knight into the game with queen to c2 immediately. Dubov spent quite a lot of time for this move, so Rajabov played queen to c2 instantly, attacking the rook and the pawn. Always a very important principle in chess: use your opponent's time. And now rook to g1, and this is where things start to go wrong for Dubov because he needs to keep an eye on that h4 pawn. Rook to d4 is the superior move here, but it's very unnatural when you're low on time to move the rook away from the back rank, as this pawn is coming very, very close to e1. So rook to g1 by Dubov, and now queen to f2, immediately going after that h4 pawn. That's why we said that maybe rook on d4 would have been better. And queen to e7 now. If the queen moves, of course, you will be able to capture the rook, but Rajabov has no plans of moving that queen. So e2, and now comes knight to c3 with a double attack on the pawn here from the queen and the knight. But here comes a brilliancy by Rajabov, bishop to g5. And there were a lot of other good moves for Rajabov, but bishop to g5 is just the absolute best one because he wants to get the queen away from the e-file. And the point is, you don't even have to capture the bishop, but it doesn't help. For example, after the queen moves, now you can block with the bishop. So there are other ways you can play this position. And now, of course, the white queen no longer guards the e1 square. But Dubov also very low on time. He grabs the bishop, and now comes e1 queen. And now black has two queens on the board for the moment. Rook captures on e1. Of course, this is forced. Queen captures with check, king to h2. And now we have this position where it's queen and rook for Rajabov against queen and knight for Dubov. But Dubov still has his two passed pawns here. If he can start pushing them, it's all good, but that's easier said than done. Here, Rajabov goes h6. He has to make some breathing room for his king so he can start activating the rook. And queen to g3. Now offering a queen trade, but Rajabov in no rush to do so. Queen to c1. Now he wants to play rook to f1, bring the rook over to h1. Hopefully end the game very quickly. So queen to d6, attacking the rook, and now rook to f1. The knight is far too far away for to be used in some checkmating sequences. He needs at least one move to d5 so he can start going somewhere like maybe e7, g6, and so on. But that's a lot of moves. So queen d8 check. We have king to h7 and queen to d3 with check. King h8. And now Dubov could repeat this. Rajabov would also be very happy to repeat because if the game ends in a draw, then Rajabov wins the first match. So Dubov needs to find something else. He goes knight to e4 and now rook to h1 with check. He had to allow this, and now the king hunt begins. King g3, we have queen captures on b2. Rajabov even takes some time to grab a pawn here. We have queen to d8 with check, king to h7, and now queen back to d3, threatening some very nasty discoveries here if the king remains there. So of course you need to move it, but first king to e5. This comes with check, king to g4, and now queen to e6 with check. Again, Rajabov very happy with a draw. King f4, and now rook captures on h4 check. King to e3, and now rook to g4, going after even more pawns. Also, rook to g3 check would be deadly, because the knight cannot move. So king to f3, attacking the rook here, and now queen to f5 with check. King e3, and now comes queen to f4 with check. King to d4, and queen to d6 check. And it was in this position that Daniil Dubov resigned the game, as the position is completely lost, well, he really needs a win to get to tie match 1, which is not happening in this position, because if you go back, then just queen to f4 check, and Rajabov would be very happy repeating this position. Or if king d4, queen d6 back, and now you try running away here, then it's just queen e5, and you are losing this piece, and then of course black will win even faster. So Dubov of course knew this. After queen to d6 check, he resigned the game, and what an incredible victory by Teymur Rajabov, not only in the game but also in the match, as he won this match by a 2-point margin. First 2 games were drawn, and then Rajabov won 2 games in a row. So very impressive display of skill by Rajabov, and something I found very weird, that people are weirded out by how Rajabov is playing this strong, but Rajabov has always been incredibly strong. So I don't know what's all the fuss about. I mean, he got into the candidates tournament and then just said I'm not going to play, and he's been crushing everyone ever since he reappeared on the chess scene. So definitely a normal result. So yeah. That's the game and the match. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. If we don't see each other, anymore after this game today, then Happy New Year to everyone. May you have a better year than the previous one was. Like I said, if you're interested in the captures merch, first link in the description below. You can get one for yourself or your parents or grandparents, whatever. They're looking really awesome. I would like to thank Lorraine Moore, Robert Kretschmar, Mark Buxton, Pratish Ghosh, and Martin Georg Paparich for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this very nice tournament, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have a happy new year, everyone.